Hello and welcome to Domicile Corporate Services podcast series Advancing Vietnam with me, Vlad Savin and Matthew Lowry. Throughout the following episodes, we'll look into answering relevant questions about doing business in Vietnam. What are the opportunities and challenges faced by investors entering the market or existing players in major industries? We will seek to understand the business environment from a cultural and local mindset and how to deal with compliance from an international perspective. What are the major risks faced by businesses active in the region and how to overcome them? And last but not least, we will dive deep into the compliance environment in Vietnam, discussing processes and procedures, changes in laws, latest official updates from the authorities, and financial governance planning for businesses active in Vietnam. In this episode, I'm discussing with Matthew Lowry, Managing Partner of Domicile Corporate Services, about how companies in Vietnam can maintain compliance and ensure their business continuity plan is sustainable. How can businesses put in place a clear corporate governance framework covering all levels of compliance and operational strategy? And how can they integrate these with an efficient risk management approach and a clear employee engagement and protection policy to overcome difficulties they are facing and also to maintain their ability to operate? Matthew, welcome to our podcast. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Vlad. I'm very glad to be here to discuss this challenging and interesting topics that affect all businesses at the moment, and look forward to discussing how we can help and how we can guide some people.
Indeed, Matthew. Unfortunately, there are difficult times ahead for companies based in Vietnam from both a compliance perspective and with their corporate structures. How can businesses adopt an efficient risk management approach on all levels of compliance to mitigate any potential complications?
It's a very broad question, but I think it's very necessary to start on that on a broad basis here. So in this time of the coronavirus, Covid-19, we are facing unprecedented challenges. And the worst thing a business can do is just stick their head in the sand. Regardless if they're operating, if they're paused, closed, there has to be a focus on the compliance and make sure that the compliance and their structures are set up for the future and it's not going to be a noose around their neck. And this involves making sure, regardless of your staffing levels, and we can talk later about staffing and about opportunities for businesses, etc. But the key thing is right now to make sure that businesses have sufficient staff to enable to deal with their compliance issues, that they use an outsourced party if necessary to do that, make sure they meet the government requirements. There's a lot of deferrals, both here in Vietnam and globally, for taxes and others, and again, we'll talk about them later. But not to avoid the actual lodgements, the deadlines, the timings, understanding the commitments, which is quite common, particularly with foreign legal representative and foreign heads of businesses in Vietnam, to just pass that responsibility on to their staff. And that's no longer something that you can rely upon in these difficult times. You need to be aware of what those obligations are. And if that means right-sizing, if that means changing what you're doing, if that means editing your plans and repositioning it, knowing what your obligations are really important. And that leads into things that will affect your staffing, that will affect your operations, that will affect your legal responsibilities that you have and you've got to meet. And I might sort of be talking about sort of this bearer of death. It's nothing like that. It's things which are good practice to be doing anyway in any scenario, but now's more important. Because what it does, it gives you ability on the upside here. We're in a V shape. There's a V coming through. How deep the V is and where the V comes out, but the world's in a V. Make sure that your business is in the right position to come out in the up of the V. And you're not being dragged down because of lack of compliance, because you didn't meet your obligations, because you didn't understand what you had to do. So if we can make sure that businesses in Vietnam, the business owners, really have that grasp of what their commitments are. They've got everything down. They've worked it through. They've downsized if necessary. They've right-sized, but they've got those key people or organisations look after them. They can come out of this with a positive. They can take advantage of the upswing, and they can be in front of others who haven't gone about that approach.
And speaking of challenges, what risks do companies face in regards to their statutory compliance? For example, the legal representative residency issues. We actually posted an article about this on our website just a few days ago.
Yeah, so that was an interesting one. The legal resident, the residency of the legal representative, because the law is very clear. You must have that at least one legal representative must be residing in Vietnam and in the country every 30 days. And so if you've got legal representatives who are stuck outside the country, you're not compliant. Now, will it have an impact in the future? Possibly. Does it mean that you don't have anyone who can actually legally sign documents? Do you have power of attorneys? And how to make sure you meet those obligations? So I think it's one of the examples of understanding the compliance environment and make sure you're on top of it. Now, for some people, that will involve appointing another legal representative who is in country. Maybe it's a staff member with restricted powers, and you can do restrictions even with a legal representative. You can sort of have restrictions within your charter. And again, talk to someone who can help with that to make sure that if you have to appoint a staff member and you don't want to give them unfettered powers for your company, you can restrict them. You could appoint a third party, but making sure that you understand. And that's where it's going to become difficult, is in signing documents, in making sure that everything is being done in accordance with the law, because we don't have many flights, borders are closed. Now, cargo flights are they're around, but there's a high demand and a low number. So therefore, documents, even couriering documents, are slower than normal. And people have to keep that in mind if they've got urgent things that have to be done, that compliance, signing things for compliance, is going to be an impediment. So with respect of other complications, yeah, there will be in making sure that audit reports are signed and lodged, which were due a few days ago, making sure that tax returns, making sure that if the government requires application for these government stimulus packages and benefits, we'll talk later, do they need signing and acceptance by someone with a power of attorney or legal representative or position of authority? So you need to get everything in order. You need to have an understanding of what is required, plan, and not just sort of go, well, I'm trapped out of Vietnam, doesn't really matter, we'll deal with it later. It is important to understand what it is you have, where you are, and what you need to do from a regulatory perspective and a structural perspective.
And what about the work permits and visa for foreign staff? What are the implications here, and what should companies do in regards to this?
Yes, this is a moving beast at the moment. We did see both. There's two different matters here. So you've got immigration issues and you've got labour law issues. They work in unison in some way, but effectively they're separate laws, and you've got to treat them separately in when you analyse them. So we've got a lot of people in country that are having difficulties because they're trapped, their visas expire, they can't leave the country to reactivate new visas, etc., etc. That at the moment is a very fluid situation. The government is allowing people to extend visas. They're being difficult with temporary resident cards, where you're seeing some but not a lot, and there's some various misunderstandings and confusions. And I expect this to be, for the next few weeks, months, to still be quite a difficult situation. So there is always an option. Some people are complaining about the costs, but predominantly they're those on tourist visas trying to extend, and those who are living in Vietnam long-term on tourist visas, I actually suggest that it's probably partly their own fault in many ways for doing that. There are other ways to have legal residence, business visas, to have temporary resident cards, etc., is a much, much more practical approach to take. And I think now proves that that's the approach that people should be taking for protection, nothing else. But there are ways to extend visas, and temporary resident cards, if they expire and they can't be extended, you can get a temporary visa to cover those. And we will move back to a normal situation. So people shouldn't be stressing. They just need to deal with those temporary matters. Visa agents in some cases are charging high fees. I basically suggest just sort of suck it up for now in a very strange situation and live with it, and it'll come back to a more normal situation. Work permits, they are accepting work permits provided you haven't been out of country before the 1st of February, or after the 1st of February this year. Those people who are after the 1st of February are not being accepted. Now, there was a decision or official letter issued by the authorities about how they're going to treat work permits. You can ignore that, because what's actually happening is very different to what they've stated, and it's a much more blanket refusal. But we do know that they will extend work permits and accept new work permits on certain circumstances. Those who can't get them through at the moment will just need to wait. Again, this will normalise. It will go back to normal, but the authorities are dealing with an unprecedented situation, and there is fear in doing things at the moment that's going to upset the future. So they just want to make sure that they're not doing something that's going to cause trouble. It will go back to normal. The big thing here is that we don't know when borders will reopen. We don't know when the world will restart. Therefore, I just tell anyone listening to this, just be patient, just be flexible, and it will work itself out.
Thank you, Matthew. Maintaining a compliance calendar assists companies in Vietnam to understand, plan, and meet their obligations with the authorities. But due to the recent complicated events, It is essential for business owners to have a clear, updated calendar to take appropriate actions during the pandemic. How should companies prepare their compliance calendar, and why you think that this is important?
Yeah, because this is sort of leading on to the earlier discussions I was mentioning about understanding compliance and making sure you complete them and don't just ignore them because of difficult times. The calendar is something that I've always used as a key guide. We've been publishing updated calendars every 6 months, which is a generic Vietnamese government compliance calendar. It's a great base to use as anyone's commercial corporate compliance calendar because it brings all the government requirements in. And it's I think that's the key document. It makes it easier having this visual document to allow business owners, managers, directors, legal representatives, and investors understand what has to happen. Group CFOs look at the Vietnamese compliance and can see what it is has to be done and who is doing it. And so it seems like a flippant comment, just do a compliance calendar, but it really is having that documented calendar-based, day-based, and an obligation-based. So if you do outsource, for example, if you're using us to do some outsource compliance obligations for tax or accounting or whatever, those understanding and allocating who is responsible and on what dates and what is the government requirement, what's the internal requirement, when is it being reviewed, who gets to use it. So that it gives the ability to if you start with a compliance calendar of some sort and then tailor it really to suit the internal needs of the company, you can see responsibilities, dates, lodgements. This means that, as I said earlier, that when we start moving back up, when the world starts opening up again, businesses are ready. They're not going to be hamstrung by the lack of action in the past. And as much as some people are in a dire situation commercially now and they don't feel that they've got the power or the need to do it, this is the most important part. It keeps you from being non-compliant and therefore facing penalties, facing restrictions, the inability to restart again, as opposed to having a compliance calendar and understanding, have a plan, have an allocation, and being ready to kick on, ready to take advantage, ready to get return on the investment that's sort of being parked at the moment, to get that return that you want and to justify all the effort you've put in to date to getting your business to where it is.
Speaking of employment, you mentioned before, during this period, business owners need to be aware and consider how they can support their employees in this difficult time. There is the difficult decision of letting staff go, where business sectors have long-term impacts, for example, tourism, or whether other arrangements can be put in place to ensure a business infrastructure remains in place for when the recovery starts to occur. What are the labor implications of the current crisis, and how should companies undertake labor compliance?
Yeah, so I actually say staff's the most important thing at the moment, because as an employer, you sort of want to look after your staff. I know there's in some places the first thing you do is cut your costs and get rid of staff. I take the different view. I think you've got to make sure that you look after the staff. There is an obligation as an employer in difficult times that you just don't throw them on the trash heap and just ignore the responsibility. So that's from a moral and ethical perspective. The other part of that is when you come out of this, your staff are going to be important. If you don't have your core staff, if you don't have the brains trust, if you don't have your history and knowledge, you don't have your operational, those who are operationally trained, you will never come out of it. So keeping that core, your staff, keeping them, looking after them, respecting what they've done for you, really is an important moral, ethical thing to do. And I think it's a very good business approach. Now, there are situations where staff have to be let go, situations where there is no work and foreseeable future. And you mentioned tourism. Yes, that's a difficult one because we just don't see when that's going to pick back up. Even when domestic, the economy start to open up again, that doesn't mean international travel is going to start by any means. So what are the options when it comes to the employment side of things and dealing with labour? So the labour law in Vietnam is quite inflexible in some ways toward the employer and more flexible to the employee, and the authorities recently have reconfirmed that there is no special scenarios really in this there. We've got to go through normal law and the normal labour law as it applies, which means that in cases like this, you can negotiate with staff to take leave. You can negotiate to go on minimum salaries to keep them on the books. And the minimum salary cannot be less than the regional minimum wage, which is around about 4.5 million dong per month, thereabouts for Zone 1 for the Ho Chi Minh City, Hanoi and similar. So you can, but that's subject to negotiation. If staff don't agree, then you cannot force them. So you could, in theory, the law allows you to reallocate someone's job responsibilities for up to 60 days. You can reduce their salary by 15%. That's a short-term measure. That's not really going to do a whole lot to your bottom line. So if you're looking at terminating, if you cannot reach an agreement with staff, and I really encourage negotiations with staff en masse, i.e. let's keep our jobs, let's keep infrastructure, let's pay minimum salary or reduce salary, let's do reduced hours, let's do something to support each other. And most staff will agree on that. If you need to terminate, there are the clause, the Labour Code, to the 2012 Labour Code, which is a current effective Labour Code. Article 38 allows for the termination of staff due to restructuring or due to financial effects. So you need to have a labour plan, labour usage plan. You need to notify staff either 30 or 45 days in advance, and you need to pay them a retrenchment, which is 2 months' salary plus half a year for basically plus a month for every year work, but it's calculated in half year in segments after the first year. And so you've got to go through that. You've got to lodge it with the authorities, but that the law does permit you to do that, and you can pay out this notice period. So there's a cost to that, and that cost for someone who's been with you for quite a long time can be significant. So if you're trying to save costs for 4 or 5 months, you might have to pay 4 or 5 months' salary to do that. Hence, back to the negotiation for en masse with a group of employees together to say, let's all help each other. Do we have an agreement? And get an agreement en masse. Because I think people and staff and employers together act rationally. Individuals by themselves may not act as rationally to protect their job and their business. They may not realise the impact. So I encourage employers to negotiate with employees, but to also understand the importance of them, so not to make any rational decisions. Now, keep in mind, employees can resign with 30 days notice, or if they've got an indefinite contract, 45 days notice. You can agree in a shorter period if they resign, but you can't force them to resign. You can maybe suggest they resign if that's going to be better than a redundancy, and you can maybe pay them less money as an option. That's the last part of the negotiations. But unlike some countries where there's labour support, income support for employers to keep employees in the books, that's not currently the case in Vietnam. We are expecting some government stimulus. We'll talk about it later. I think that's you're going to ask me a bit later about that as one of your questions later about stimulus. We'll talk about that, which may impact employees. And also keep in mind that employees do have unemployment insurance in Vietnam, and for lower paid employees, that's can be a fairly significant income stream for them if they've been contributing to the system for a while. So that is also an option to consider. So it's not employees that do leave aren't just thrown on the street. There is a government support sitting behind them, but just keep in mind the effect of your business and the individuals.
And you mentioned insurance just before, and also from the employee's perspective, how does insurance work in case employees get sick, for example, and what benefits do they get, or how does the company can support them in that difficulty?
Okay, so for employees and employers contribute to the insurance funds, one of them being health insurance. So if an employee is sick and therefore they, with COVID-19 or whatever else, they can access the insurance, and the insurance will basically cover them for their majority of their salary during the period that they're not employed, they're not working. So that is a claim against the government, against the insurance fund. The employer does not need to pay the employee whilst they're off sick. If they're in quarantine or they're in isolation and they are not, it's for protecting the community or monitoring that they are not sick, then you've got a bit of an issue. Because the health insurance fund will only cover people who for medical conditions. So if you not medical conditions, if you can't work, therefore the employer might have to come to an arrangement. So if they can do some work while in isolation, fine. But if they can't, they maybe have to negotiate that as unpaid leave or annual leave or something else, because it is not covered by the fund. There's also force majeure events where if a foreign employee or a Vietnamese employee is abroad and can't return to Vietnam because of border controls, whatever else, that can be a breach of labour contracts to the extent where it can actually be a forced termination because of force majeure events. And that may be one of those small scenarios where, because of the inability to turn up to work, they can be terminated. But being in isolation and quarantine in Vietnam doesn't meet that criteria, but it also doesn't meet the criteria for insurance claims. So that will need to be negotiated and discussed. And this is where employers need to be fair and employees need to be fair to make sure that everyone is looking after each other in the process.
I see. And the last question. Vietnamese authorities have proposed various levels of business support, and in coming days we expect these to be formally announced and signed by the Prime Minister for implementation. Do you have any information about how does the government support businesses active in Vietnam, and what are these releases going to be about?
So we've seen an earlier draft of the tax stimulus package. We have seen highlights of the revised draft that was submitted to the Prime Minister. We actually haven't seen the final recommended decree. So I'm talking about expectations, not about the law or the actual interpretation. So it's vague at the moment. The Department of Labour, Ministry of Labour has also sent out information of what they want to do with respect to employees as well. So we are expecting deferred tax payments. So for quarterly businesses, we're expecting 2 quarters. The payments that are due in April, we're expecting deferral for 5 months, and again for the payments in July. So quarter 1, quarter 2 payments, 5-month deferrals. For monthly taxpayers, we're expecting March, April, May and June months to be deferred. Now that is VAT, and that is likely PIT as well. So the employee tax portion.
Sorry to interrupt. Is this for all sectors or just for specific ones that will be highly affected?
Very good point, because it is at the moment is specific sectors. It's quite narrowly defined in the first draft, but it did cover small and micro. Now there's definitions in tax law, small and micro. We've got to make sure that the definitions are the same. Then there's a lot of defined ones like textiles, tourism, etc. that are affected. The final version that I understand was submitted to the Prime Minister was much broader than that. So I don't have the final list of companies and sectors. I would be surprised if most sectors were not covered, to be honest. I really think at the end of the day, the vast majority of businesses in Vietnam will be affected and a vast majority will get some relief. That's what I'm hoping for. Now we'll see if that is the case. So we've got VAT and PIT deferrals for 5 months. We've got theoretically corporate income tax payments deferrals. Now these are all deferrals. So where we've got Ministry of Labour's coming in, they're suggesting deferrals. But if we go back to 2008, there was a deferral back in the financial crisis where we saw deferrals being eventually cancelled and not remitted in the end. They were given back. So whether the PIT is given back to employees for them to spend as a stimulus, or whether they're forgiven as a benefit to the employer as an obligation not to remit, will be interesting to see if that's part of the process. Because what we want is employee stimulus to get them to make sure they've got income to spend, and employer stimulus to make sure they've got the cash flow to retain staff and to keep their business alive and run the business. So we know there is going to be definitely employer stimulus by way of deferrals, whether they remove that obligation to pay and make it a permanent benefit and or a benefit to the employees, we'll see. I also have seen through the Labour authorities wishing to remove the need to pay certain insurances for a period of time as well to take pressure off and therefore more money into the pockets of employers and employees, remove that obligations. So there are some of the things they're doing. We've also seen in Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City authorities themselves, and this is specialised just in Ho Chi Minh City, have announced they're going to use some of their salary increase in their budget to not increase the government salaries, but to use that to provide a fund to pay a minimum amount of money to those unemployed who have difficulties. And that includes people without formal jobs, shoe shine, street vendors, those sort of people. They've actually said there's a small amount of money, I think it's like $45 a month, thereabouts equivalent, that they would have available for those who no longer can support themselves because their usual occupation is restricted. So that is going to be an interesting how that is dispersed, how the process to register, and what we need to do. But I think those sort of economic stimuluses are really important and will exist. That's the backbone to make sure that industry continues, make sure the industry feels supported, and there's a reason for those like F&B who are impacted very hard, that they have the infrastructure ready to go and their staff and their training and everything they've put in place so far when the upswing starts coming, and it's not just a desolate landscape. And that's Vietnam. That's everywhere. That's not unique to this country.
Thank you, Matthew. And one last question. You've been part of Australian Chamber for quite some time. Domicile is also part of Eurochamp. How do you see the businesses and part of these chambers and the community react? And how do you think the relationship with the government is at the moment?
So, yeah, I've been involved with the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam for many, many years, former president, treasurer as well. What we're seeing is that the chambers are providing, have moved their strategy to much an online education. They're trying to provide practical information as resource to their members, and they're trying to support businesses now through a difficult time. So this is one of the support networks. You always need your support networks in country. I think more importantly than ever, that support network, knowing that there's like-minded businesses, like-minded nationals, be it European Chamber or the sub-chambers, be it Australia, AmCham, British Chambers, any of the other chambers that exist, to have that support network, to have that information, to join the online, the webinars that they're doing, having that information and having information shared by those around you suffering the same problems and issues. When it comes to the government side, they are all working with their embassies and consulates to have a single voice going through the government. So if you're following any of the social media for the governments, they are very active in dealing with it, supporting their nationals as best they can. There's only so much they can do. But from a business point of view, they do have a bit more power. It's easier to deal with business issues and bilaterals than it is to do with immigration matters. The immigration is a very domestic issue, whereby bilateral trade matters and business issues are much easier to deal with. So those sort of things through the business chamber goes to the government. It's a point of contact between the businesses and governments, because then government to government can work with the business chambers, feeding information, providing support, and then feeding that back to the individual members. So that's where I think it's a really interesting shift, and it's a sideways shift to where the business chambers have been operating in the past. They're no longer doing social events. We have social distancing says we can't get together. That doesn't mean they're not useful. So there is a shift, and there is a change in what they are, and I think it's more necessary than ever to be involved and have that support network in place.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, Matthew, for your insights, and I hope this discussion brought more clarity about the issues faced by investors in Vietnam in this concerning period.
You're very welcome, Vlad, and I look forward to the next podcast.
Maintaining an efficient corporate compliance framework in this time of crisis is not easy. However, it is critical to have a plan which covers all the key areas of the business from an operational perspective. Workforce support with potential work-from-home arrangements where possible, accounting, tax, and statutory compliance, advancing digital transformation, and create a risk management strategy. Many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on domicilecs.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact myself or Matthew on LinkedIn or through the website contact details.